Welcome to another big train tour at the Colorado Railroad Museum. Today, we'll be taking a look at Rio Grande Southern Caboose number 0404. Constructed in 1902, this long caboose was constructed as this legendary narrow-gauge railroad entered its second decade of service in southwestern Colorado. Acquired by museum founder Bob Richardson in the early 1950s, this one-of-a-kind survivor has been displayed for decades at the museum in Golden. In 2025, number 0404 was thoroughly rehabilitated by the car shop team at the Durango and Silverton narrow-gauge railroad in Durango. Hi, I'm Paul Hammond, Executive Director of the Colorado Railroad Museum. Our subject today is a diminutive wood-bodied caboose home-built in the shops of its parent railroad. Like many rail vehicles, and especially narrow-gauge ones, it started its life with a somewhat different appearance. Throughout its service life, this caboose was involved in various mishaps, rebuilt and altered several times, and finally retired. Come with me now as we explore the history of Rio Grande Southern Caboose number 0404. The San Juan Mountains of southwest Colorado are known for their rugged, vertical grandeur. Gold was first discovered in the area in the 1860s, leading to settlements like Silverton in 1874, and soon thereafter Ouray, Telluride, and Rico. The forced removal of Native American Utes opened the region further to settlement, and the arrival of the Denver and Rio Grande Railroad in Durango in 1881 further boosted the region's fortunes. The railroad line was extended north from Durango to Silverton in 1882, with plans to push further north to Ouray. However, the company soon proclaimed this extension was too formidable for a railroad. The Rio Grande Southern had its beginning just a few years later. Visionary financier Otto Mears, known as the Pathfinder of the San Juans, founded the line to provide railroad service to the mining settlements surrounding Rico and Telluride in southwestern Colorado. Up to this time, stagecoaches and freight outfitters served the region, with winter significantly complicating travel. Mears was determined to connect Silverton with surrounding mining towns, and he was successful to a point. But even he could not overcome the geography between Silverton and Ouray. Undaunted, Mears in 1889 incorporated an entirely new railroad running north out of Durango. Known as the Rio Grande Southern, this line would run from Durango to Ridgway, circumnavigating the San Juan Mountains and connecting with a newly completed extension of the Denver and Rio Grande to Ouray. The Rio Grande Southern climbed over 4 mountain passes with steep grades, including Dallas Divide west of Ridgway and Lizard Head Pass north of Rico. It followed river canyons and was carved into mountainsides, and repeatedly subject to washouts as well as heavy snow. Perhaps the most notable engineering feature along the route was the Ophir Loop near Ophir. The railroad was constructed working from both ends. One team worked from Durango and headed north, while the other worked from Ridgway south. Completed in 2 years, the Rio Grande Southern's first train made a round trip on December 26, 1891, after the final rail was laid just south of Rico. The railroad's completion immediately was met with a boom in traffic, transporting ore efficiently from mining camps to smelters, and making it easier for farmers and ranchers to bring their goods to market. Like other bonanza railroads, the Rio Grande Southern at first enjoyed a high rate of return for investors. But then the unthinkable happened, the nationwide financial panic of 1893. The Sherman Silver Purchase Act was repealed, and the price of silver plunged overnight. Since silver ore and mining-related materials were the Rio Grande Southern's primary cargo, the railroad's revenues plunged and the company went into receivership. It came under the control of the Denver and Rio Grande for many years. But when the Great Depression hit, it was again reorganized, this time without the direct involvement of success for Denver and Rio Grande Western. Until 1952, when the line was officially abandoned, the Rio Grande Southern would always be in precarious financial shape. The railroad struggled on through the 1920s and 1930s, with the lack of all-weather roads in southeast Colorado playing a large role in sustaining it. During the Great Depression, Its shop crews developed the famed Galloping Goose motorcars as a practical and cash-saving alternative to running complete steam trains along the line, and thus preserving the all-important U.S. mail contract for many years. During World War II, the line received loans from the Defense Supplies Corporation, an agency of the federal government, to assist in keeping the line running. After the war, it became clear that the railroad had secretly been carrying yellowcake ore. This ore, used in the manufacture of uranium, had benefited the Manhattan Project in producing the world's first atomic bomb. The Rio Grande Southern's steam locomotives were acquired secondhand, and nearly all of its freight and passenger cars, and even maintenance of way equipment, were likewise used too. Interestingly, cabooses were another matter. Just 2 of the railroad's 7 cabooses were purchased used. The Denver and Rio Grande built 4 others, and the final caboose, number 0404, was built at the railroad's Ridgway, Colorado shops. Number 0404 would remain unique, holding the distinction of being the only railroad car constructed new by the Rio Grande Southern. The caboose today is regarded as an icon of American popular culture, even though cabooses basically disappeared from modern-day freight trains in the 1980s. But even though an end-of-train car for crews existed almost from the 1830s beginning of American railroading, it took several decades for cabooses to take on the familiar appearance they became known for. The first caboose was quite basic. An empty boxcar at the end of a freight train provided an office for the train's conductor, complete with a wood box for a chair and a barrel for a desk. Other early cabooses were nothing more than flat cars with small cabins or shacks erected on them. These resembled the galley or cook shack on a ship's deck, and it's possible that the very word caboose is derived from 18th century Dutch, French, or English words meaning cook's shack. Whatever its form, the caboose was created to provide shelter for those members of the train crew who were based at the tail end of a train. In the 19th century, freight trains typically had brakemen assigned to the rear of the train as well as the front. The forward brakemen typically found refuge in the locomotive cab until they were called into action. Those stationed at the back of the train also needed a place to ride. The way car or caboose became the place for these trainmen to find refuge from the weather, and also to remain vigilant and observe the train itself as the trip progressed. Cupolas, which provide a raised vantage point from which to inspect the train while in motion, are another feature long associated with cabooses. T.B. Watson, a conductor with the Chicago and Northwestern, is credited with creating the first cupola caboose in 1863. The idea caught on because it aided trainmen in visually identifying problems such as shifting loads, derailments, and overheated axle bearings known as hot boxes. It would take a while for the caboose and the cupola to evolve into a more or less typical appearance. Caboose number 0404 came along at a time when this evolution had largely run its course. But even so, interesting variations, including a complete lack of a cupola on some cabooses, could still be found in service well into the 20th century. Cabooses on the Rio Grande Southern were originally referred to as way cars, and their original numbers reflected this. The prefix W was followed by a 3-digit number in the 400 series. So, for instance, the railroad's first caboose or way car was numbered W400. Most of the line's cabooses were introduced between 1890 and 1892, when the railroad was booming. The Denver and Rio Grande built 4 new cabooses for the Rio Grande Southern at its Burnham shops in Denver, numbered W400 through W403. Another 2 cabooses, numbers W404 and W409, were placed in service, having been formerly owned by the Denver and Rio Grande and its Utah affiliate, the Rio Grande Western. These railroads were jointly standard gauging a main line from Denver to Salt Lake City at this same time. Thus, a number of used narrow-gauge locomotives and cars were available. All of these early Rio Grande Southern cabooses were short models, featuring 2 windows on each end, 3 windows on each side, and a central cupola featuring 2 and 2 windows. One of the 2 used cabooses, number W404, was retired by 1895. This was likely due to a lack of traffic following the financial panic, as well as the need for repairs the cash-strapped railroad couldn't afford. 4 other cabooses purchased from the Rio Grande Western were so worn out the Rio Grande Southern refused to place them in service at all, even though numbers were held for them on the caboose roster. Traffic had picked up enough by 1900 that another caboose was needed. This time around, the railroad decided to build the caboose itself, using its own shop crews in Ridgeway. In another first, this would become the only long caboose to grace the Rio Grande Southern roster. Its design was similar to cabooses built and operated by the Denver and Rio Grande. The new caboose would be assigned the same number, W404, that had been vacated when its worn-out predecessor was retired in 1895. This second caboose number W404 has a body that measures 28 feet 6.5 inches long over the insills, with the cupola offset to one end and a light box atop the cupola used for signaling the head end of the train at night. Equipped with a coal stove for heat, the new caboose likely saw a number change sometime between 1907 and 1909. At that time, the Rio Grande Southern dropped the W prefix in its caboose numbers and substituted a 0 instead. Our subject caboose was known thereafter as Caboose 0404. Early assignment records indicate number 0404 was often found on the railroad's first district, stretching from Ridgeway to Rico. During its long life with the railroad, caboose number 0404 undoubtedly journeyed all across the Rio Grande Southern. Not only did it and its siblings bring up the rear on freight trains running between Ridgeway, Rico, and Durango, but these cars could even be found as part of the line's snow fighting trains in wintertime, providing sleeping quarters for crew members during long trips to clear frequent, deep snowfalls from the tracks. As an interesting aside, invoices from 1908 show that the Rio Grande Southern leased telegraphones, which were kept in every caboose and baggage car, as well as being permanently installed at a number of key locations along the railroad. These devices, which were used at least until the early 1940s, allowed voice calls to be made over traditional telegraph circuits while still allowing telegraph messaging to continue. Invented by a Denver and Rio Grande telegraph operator, call quality was rather low, so these telegraphones were used to relay messages among track workers and to report incidents like rock slides and other delays. The telegraph itself was still used for transmitting train orders and other dispatching-related messages for train movements. The railroad operating environment of the 19th century was quite primitive compared to today. Especially in the Colorado Rockies, trains were typically short because early steam engines were not all that powerful. Locomotives simply couldn't budge the train if too much tonnage was added. Conversely, when coming downhill, the speed of the descending train had to be controlled closely. The Rio Grande Southern's trains and cabooses were equipped with air brakes from the beginning. This makes sense, especially considering the line interchanged with the Denver and Rio Grande at both ends, and most of its cars and locomotives came secondhand from other railroads that were already using these same braking systems. These early air brake systems employed what is known as straight air, in which air pressure is used directly to apply the brakes. The main drawback was that if a train broke apart or otherwise lost air pressure, the brakes stopped working, usually quite suddenly. Although not fail-safe, these early air brake systems were far more effective at stopping trains than the alternatives. Before air brakes, the locomotive engineer had only cylinder back pressure, as well as a single handbrake on the locomotive's tender at his immediate command. When more braking was needed, brakes were applied on each individual car by hand by brakemen who themselves had to traverse the tops of freight cars to perform this dangerous job. With this system, a train headed downhill could quickly gain speed and run away from its crew before sufficient brakes were applied. Air brakes helped to change this situation for the better. Another operating challenge was couplers. The link and pin coupling system was standard on the Rio Grande Southern's freight cars from the 1890s through the early 1900s. This was also the case for the Denver and Rio Grande narrow gauge network. Brakemen signaled the engine crew to switch cars into position, and then they had to step out of view, lift the link to guide it into a pocket, and drop the pin into the link at precisely the correct moment, while the locomotive pushed the last few inches together. Uncoupling was just as challenging. The whole process was tricky and unpredictable, and the locomotive crew could not see the brakeman at the most critical moments, so many things could and did go wrong. Any miscalculation or error on the brakeman's part could result in the loss of a finger, the amputation of a hand or a leg, or even death, usually by being crushed or impaled. When riding inside the caboose or way car, brakemen did their best to watch the train ahead for any signs of overheated axle bearings, dragging brakes, derailment, or other danger. They would also monitor the air brake pressure gauge mounted inside the caboose. Any drop in pressure could spell trouble, quickly disabling a train's stopping ability, as noted earlier. In this environment, multiple brakemen were assigned to each train. This was one of the most dangerous jobs in the country, as well as one of the most popular. It was easy to be thrown off the tops of cars or to fall overboard while yanking on a brake wheel with a stick, or to lose a digit or a limb when working with link and pin couplers. Railroad work was some of the most dangerous in the 19th century, and the job of brakeman was for many years the single most dangerous occupation in the U.S. The job remained popular, however, because it could lead to promotion and advancement. The conductor, who was the actual captain of the train, was also based out of the caboose. There, he filled out paperwork documenting each freight car's identity and contents. A desk inside the caboose made his task much easier. Coal stoves provided heat, as well as a place to boil water for coffee or even to cook a quick meal. There were even places to take a nap or sleep, depending on the length of the run and other factors. But an often overlooked fact was that many injuries occurred onboard cabooses because of sudden changes in train speed and velocity, which could toss crew members around violently. Major shifts in the railroad safety environment were taking place during the Rio Grande Southern's first decade of operation. The U.S. government, spurred on by railroad workers and concerned citizens, had dictated that air brakes and so-called automatic couplers would become standard equipment on the country's railroads by the turn of the 20th century. The state of Colorado also passed legislation requiring the new couplers. So, by around 1905, the line's rolling stock is believed to have been in compliance. Safety regulations broadened to mandate ladders and grab irons for crew safety by 1913, and records show that the railroad had complied within just a couple of years. Another major improvement in the early years of the 20th century was legislation limiting the number of hours that could be worked in a single shift. Although the job of brakeman remained a hard-working one, the risk of death or injury to trainmen overall began to decline noticeably. The Rio Grande Southern, for much of its existence, maintained a contract with the U.S. Postal Service, carrying the mail to and from towns along the route. This contract essentially ensured that passenger trains would run through the 1920s, even though the actual number of passengers was declining. The onset of the Great Depression resulted in the railroad's successful experimentation with Galloping Goose rail motorcars for carrying the mail and passengers, and after that, steam-powered passenger trains ran very infrequently. Freight trains continued to run, however, because there simply was no alternative. This in turn meant that the railroad's caboose fleet remained in demand. Throughout the 1930s and into the 1940s, the railroad's steam locomotives were photographed pulling trains filled with oil bound for refineries or headed for smelters, sheep and cattle coming to graze seasonally in the high country along the line, and all sorts of mining equipment and supplies for the remote region. Paved highways would come late to the San Juan Mountain region, helping to ensure the line's continuation long after its demise seemed inevitable. Over the years, the Rio Grande Southern had a reputation for derailments and wrecks in spite of limited mileage and traffic. According to original documents in the Colorado Railroad Museum archives, Caboose 0404 was involved in numerous accidents. Some of these are known to have been major, while others were probably slow-speed collisions or the minor derailments that the railroad was unfortunately well known for. In 1925, presumably after an accident, The Caboose was rebuilt by the Denver and Rio Grande Western at its Alamosa shops. At this time, the two individual side windows on each side of the cupola were replaced by single windows. This same modification can be seen on a number of Denver and Rio Grande Western cabooses from around the same time frame. While caboose number 0404 was in Alamosa for repairs, the Rio Grande Southern borrowed caboose number 0518 from the larger railroad to fill in. During another rebuilding in 1940, caboose 0404 lost the light box atop its cupola, as well as the quarter-round molding which graced the corners of its car body. This 19th century touch was found at one time on all of the line's cabooses. The caboose at this time also received the railroad's well-known Sunrise Herald, which it would only wear for a short time. Unfortunately, the car was involved in a rather spectacular and well-documented runaway wreck on Dallas Divide just 3 years later. It sat on the Ridgeway deadline until 1945, when crews finally got around to rebuilding the 0404 once again. Returned to service in 1947, caboose number 0404 seems to have become a fixture operating out of Durango to Rico on the railroad's southern end throughout the late 1940s and into the early 1950s. The railroad by this time had been discovered by rail enthusiasts. Thus, far more images of the caboose exist from this era than any other. When, sadly, the line was abandoned, number 0404 was part of the trains that were used to salvage rails and other metal components along the line. The Rio Grande Southern's hard-fought life had finally come to an end. Luckily, Colorado Railroad Museum founder Bob Richardson kept his eye on the 0404. In 1951 or 1952, as the Rio Grande Southern's dismantling was getting underway, Richardson arranged for the car's purchase. When the work was completed, the caboose was shipped via the Denver and Rio Grande Western to Alamosa, where it was photographed alongside vintage diesel locomotives and other Rio Grande cabooses before being trucked to the nearby narrow-gauge motel and museum in South Alamosa for display. When Richardson decided to move his collection of locomotives and railroad cars from Alamosa to Golden in the late 1950s, caboose 0404 was an early arrival at the new Colorado Railroad Museum. It could be found there on display, and starting in the early 1960s, the caboose was even operated during occasional steam-ups pulled behind Denver and Rio Grande Western locomotive number 346. The primary change to its appearance was the addition of a light box atop the cupola, which backdated the caboose to pre-1940. Over the next 6 decades in Golden, caboose 0404 was repainted several times. No major rebuilding work is known to have been undertaken during this long stretch, although the siding was replaced on one side. For many years, the car sported 2 different paint schemes, one on each side. This unfortunately meant that when viewing one of the sides, the Rio Grande Southern's Sunrise Herald clashed with the cupola-top light box, as these features didn't coexist during the car's service years. In 2020, as Rio Grande Southern steam locomotive number 20's 14-year restoration was concluding, the caboose was brought into the museum roundhouse for some attention. Given its status as another Rio Grande Southern artifact, it would co-star when number 20 debuted later that year. The light box atop the cupola was removed at this time, with the humorous discovery of several repurposed railroad museum signs that had been turned into flashing when the light box was first reinstalled in the early 1960s. Also at this time, the caboose was repainted and relettered to showcase its late 1940s appearance, which it retained through its early 1950s retirement. Otherwise, though, no major structural or restoration work was done. When locomotive number 20 traveled to the Cumbres and Toltec for special excursions in 2021, caboose 0404 stayed behind in Golden. But by 2025, a new opportunity dawned. That summer, the museum, together with the Durango and Silverton narrow-gauge railroad, announced that Rio Grande Southern number 20 would travel to Durango for special excursions in winter 2026. The museum's leadership team wondered, what if caboose 0404 could tag along too? Thanks to a significant challenge grant and the support of generous donors, this chance quickly became reality. A contract to rehabilitate the Caboose was signed between the museum and the Durango and Silverton, and number 0404 was loaded aboard a tractor-trailer rig in May 2025 and whisked off to Durango. There, its wood frame received major repairs, along with all manner of minor woodwork throughout the car. The tongue-and-groove exterior siding was removed, sorted, and replaced as necessary. Roofing was renewed, and the Caboose was repainted and relettered to represent its final years of service on the Rio Grande Southern. Work progressed through the summer and fall of 2025, and as of early 2026, this one-of-a-kind Colorado railroading icon was ready to bring up the rear on the special excursions planned for January and February that year, operating out of Durango. Things had come full circle, bringing number 0404 back to a town that it often called home during its Rio Grande Southern service years. Following these excursions, Caboose 0404 was slated to return to Golden, where it will again be displayed and occasionally operated for benefit of photographers, passengers, and rail enthusiasts. These special excursions were also a part of the Colorado Railroad Museum's special 2026 programming, helping to commemorate Colorado's 150th anniversary and America's 250th anniversary this same year. Thanks for joining me today. Rio Grande Southern Caboose 0404 continues to serve as an icon of Colorado railroading, and its evolution through wrecks, rebuildings, and upgrades highlights a constant theme in the history of the state's narrow-gauge railroads. Its lengthy career on the famed Silver San Juan Scenic Line serves not only as a connection to southwestern Colorado, but also to the many dedicated railroaders who helped shape the expansion, settlement, and transformation of Colorado into today's centennial state. I hope you've enjoyed our tour of Rio Grande Southern Caboose number 0404 and its unique history. I also hope that your appreciation for Colorado's rich railroad heritage continues to grow with each and every tour of the museum's collections.
Like, comment, share, and subscribe. Commenting and sharing in particular may qualify as virtual engagements for important funding programs like the SCFD.